Nicole Rancourt and the Maine Humanities Council for selecting the Liberty Library to host one of their World in Your Library programs. And they did the arrangement for the speaker, and I'm very pleased to have Meadow Dibble, and she's the founding director of Atlantic Black Box. Currently, she's a visiting scholar at Brown University's Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. But Meadow is not new to Maine, as she taught Francophone African literature, that's my first question, is what is that, at Colby College from 2005 to 2008. Originally from Cape Cod, and lived for 6 years on Senegal's Cape Verde Peninsula prior to pursuing her graduate studies. Since 2014, she's been the editor of The International Educator, a cultural magazine, and coordinating foreign study programs. So without further ado, this is Meadow Dibble.
Thank you so much, Barb. Many thanks for the invitation. I'm so pleased to be with you here at Liberty Library, and grateful too to the wonderful Maine Humanities Council that has just so many important programs, especially in these times when one can feel disconnected. They do a wonderful work to reconnect us in important ways through conversation. I am going to straight away share my screen. And I'm going to start telling you a story, the story of the diseased ship, which is the subject of a book that I'm currently working on and a podcast that is in production. If you had been standing on Boston's Long Wharf 200 years ago on August 1st, 1819, you would have smelled the ship long before you saw it. The putrid odor that blew into the harbor that day made the entire city sick to its stomach. Dock workers, accustomed to wretched stenches, suddenly found themselves doubled over, wrapped in a sickly embrace so suffocating they would talk about it for years to come. Even customs agents, sitting in their stately offices high above the harbor, were not spared the revolting stench. Merchants, laundresses, candle makers, street kids, if you were human and had a nose, you could not help but stop whatever it was you were doing to scan the horizon for the source of the corruption. And then it appeared. The 10 Brothers, the long-awaited tall ship, belonging to some of the biggest names in Boston shipping: Humphrey, Lyman, Dodge, and Thorndike. These were the sons of New England's wealthiest, most influential merchant traders, at least one of whom, Thorndike Sr., had made part of his fortune in the slave trade. When they launched this joint venture 11 months earlier, this group of trust fund kids had expected to reach major profits. And now their ship had finally come in. Only, mortifyingly, it reeked to high heaven. Worst of all, from an investor's point of view anyway, there was very little cargo in the hold, mostly just stones and ballast. It is a matter of common remark that no ship has arrived in our harbor for many years in so foul a state as the 10 Brothers, attested one witness. It has been stated by people of veracity that the ship was extremely foul, echoed another, so as to be offensive to the senses even when coming up the harbor. What exactly had happened on board this ship after its crew of Cape Cod men pulled anchor and sailed for Sierra Leone 11 months earlier, on September 1st, 1818? What cargo had the vessel carried from West Africa to the West Indies? And what could have imbued its every timber with a putrescence so revolting that no amount of scrubbing or fumigating could successfully mask the horrific stench? Within days of the ship's return to Boston following its 11-month voyage, the population's disgust would turn to terror, as sailors and dock workers and customs officials, having had contact with the ship, turned a shocking shade of yellow and started to bleed from every orifice before dying in contorted fits of agony. One 19th century commentator offered an account that might sound eerily familiar to us today, now that we have witnessed the devastating impact of COVID-19 on communities in the greater Boston area. Quote, "There were instances in Boston the last summer where one after another in a family was suffered to sicken and die, with scarcely a friend to administer the medicine which was prescribed by the physician. Neighbors were afraid to aid each other, although in reality exposed to the same common danger, and brother was afraid to visit brother. Strangers closed the eyes of the dying and hurried them to the grave as soon as the last breath was drawn." 200 years ago, a collective tragedy played out right here in coastal New England, much like the one we are currently experiencing on a global scale. Only in the summer of 1819, it was not the coronavirus that was wreaking havoc on the population. It was the yellow fever virus. Just as investigators today have been able to trace the source of Boston's 2020 outbreak of COVID-19 to that fateful Biogen conference that turned out to be a super spreader event, in that same way, the source of the yellow fever outbreak that ravaged Boston's waterfront 2 centuries ago was patently obvious to public health officials of the day. In fact, it seems the entire city was unanimous in accusing the ship 10 Brothers of carrying a plague in the place of a cargo. The similarities between these two outbreaks hardly end there, but while a lot of folks have turned to history for answers about how we might handle our present challenges, most have sought to draw lessons from the devastating influenza pandemic of 1918. Why is no one talking about the epidemic that took place 100 years earlier? And the answer is because it was simply left out of the history books. As I tell you the story of the diseased ship, one I dug up in my hometown and have spent the past 4 years reconstructing, I would like you to consider a couple of questions. One, how could a story as big as this one have been omitted from the historical record and entirely forgotten? Two, what does this oversight suggest about the way New England's history was written? What does it tell us about the way our regional identity was constructed? And three, why does it matter that we know our history? I hope that you will share your own thoughts and responses to these questions during the Q&A session after my presentation, as well as ask your own questions, which I'll be happy to take. I wanted to start though with a confession, which is that 4 years ago, I had never heard of the 10 Brothers, although its captain and its crew all hailed from my hometown of Brewster on Cape Cod. Nor, must I say, did I know the first thing about New England's role in the slave trade. My training was in literature, not history. So, by the way, Barb, Francophone African literature is simply African literature written in French that emerges from the former French and Belgian colonies. Everything changed one day when I decided to take a shortcut through the cemetery in my old childhood neighborhood behind the First Parish Church. And I happened upon a white marble headstone where it was inscribed, "Benjamin Crosby died in Africa, 1795, at the age of 27. Africa, I thought. What had Crosby been doing there? I had spent 6 years on the continent myself, and although I was cautious, not wanting to jump to any conclusions, I felt quite certain that his motivations and mine in going there were worlds apart. Could Crosby have been involved in the slave trade? I wondered. In order to even ask this question, my mind had to struggle like a fish swimming upstream against the raging flow of subtle and overt messages I had received throughout my entire childhood about the intrepid seafaring men who had built my town through their courage and their grit and their famous Yankee ingenuity. This is a sign that was carved by my own father, of whom I am very proud. And it's a sign that, it's here at the entrance to the Lower Road Cemetery in Brewster. And here we are talking about monuments and whether monuments should come down, whether they should be thrown in the ocean, whether they should go to museums. And I would argue that this is one such monument. Once my mind had actually made the leap to asking the question, could these revered sea captains have been involved in the slave trade, I began looking all around me and wondering, could these men, who we so admire, have been in fact involved in the most heinous crime against humanity that took place over 5 centuries. I went to the libraries. There were no books on the topic. Cape Cod slave trade, Cape Cod slavery, Cape Cod West Indies. I did all the searching I knew how to do in the online catalogs. I went to the Historical Society and asked these questions, but no one was able to give me any satisfying answers. I went to the town hall, to the historic town vault, and I suffered the cold stare of the town clerk as I pursued these questions and came back day after day to flip through my hometown's church records going all the way back to 1700. I also asked my friends and family, anyone, in fact, who would listen to me. And the responses I received were very discouraging. One came outright denial. No, we were absolutely not involved in the slave trade. The second type of response I received was a sort of equivocation. Well, no, we were not involved in the slave trade. However, we were involved in the West Indies trade. But this was said almost as though that commerce was benevolent. We were provisioning the West Indies with food. The third type of response I received was just sort of a shrug, an indifference. I suppose it shouldn't surprise us if we were involved in the slave trade. And of all three responses, disturbing in their own ways, I found the third sort the most disturbing because I thought really it shouldn't surprise us. True, it should horrify us if this were indeed the case, and it should horrify us that we weren't talking about this subject, that we weren't asking these questions. So try as I might, I found no smoking guns lying around within easy reach. But I had found this evidence in the cemetery. So I went back to the cemeteries. And what I discovered there, inscribed in stone, was evidence of a presence in West Africa, for certain, as well as a very heavy traffic between my town, Brewster, and the West Indies. Cuba in particular. And this active commerce was taking place at the moment in Cuba's history, in the first 3 decades of the 19th century, when Cuba was in fact the hub of the illicit slave trade. So what I learned in then digging into this question, what were these Brewster men doing in Cuba, is that Cuba, like the other islands of the West Indies, was so good at producing sugar that it had been clear cut, and sugar was a monoculture, and that all of New England was involved in provisioning these plantations, sugar plantations of the West Indies, with the food and the lumber and the hardware needed to run these plantations that were fueled entirely by slave labor. In other words, this was one leg of the famous triangle trade. We were heavily involved in it. But still, there were no smoking guns, no way to say for sure what Benjamin Crosby had been doing in Africa. And then someone happened to mention that Elijah Cobb had also been to Africa. And here I thought I was in luck because I learned Elijah Cobb had written a memoir. And here it is. This is the man who literally created my hometown by engineering its secession from the town of Harwich in 1803. He is our founding father, and he is very much revered. In fact, the house that he built in 1799 is now home to the Brewster Historical Society. From rags to riches, you could say, Cobb's story reads like a typical Horatio Alger novel. You are probably familiar with the scenario. Young boy born into poverty managed to overcome his humble beginnings through grit, wit, courage, determination, and perhaps a bit of luck. And if you add to that list charm and good looks, you have Elijah Cobb. The Brewster boy had gone off to sea at the age of 15, and by the time his own children came along, he had amassed a small fortune, and he could shower Elijah Jr. and the others with every privilege, sparing them the hardship that he himself had known. This merchant mariner accumulated many honors, as you can see, and titles over the course of his long and impressive career. Between voyages and after retiring from the sea in 1820, Elijah Cobb managed to serve Brewster in just about every capacity imaginable. He was town treasurer, town clerk, inspector general, justice of the peace, representative and senator to the Massachusetts legislature. As a member of the militia, he even climbed to the rank of brigadier general. These achievements are all the more impressive when you consider that at the age of 6, after Cobb's father died at sea, his mother had sent him to live with another family in town where he was forced to do hard labor to earn his keep. In other words, Elijah Cobb was more or less indentured. And it's actually entirely possible that Elijah Cobb could have been a source of inspiration for the prolific novelist Horatio Alger, whose dime novels for boys could be found in virtually every American household throughout the Gilded Age. And that is because the Chelsea-born writer would have been intimately familiar with Cobb's story. Prior to getting his start as a novelist, Alger spent 2 years in Brewster as minister of the First Parish Church, just a few short years after the sea captain's death. And someone so invested in the possibility of rising from humble beginnings to glory would have recognized in Cobb's upward mobility and in the memoir that he left the very stuff of the American dream that Alger helps to articulate. Here in Elijah Cobb was a true self-made man. Cobb was even born on the 4th of July, 8 years before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, as if he were some happy harbinger or precursor that perfectly embodied our national character or aspirations. In his memoir, Cobb tells us about his first overseas voyage to Suriname. This is a very unflattering portrait of Rhode Island merchants carousing in Suriname, getting drunk, throwing up on one another, etc. That was the destination of Cobb's first overseas voyage. He tells us in his memoir about trading in the West Indies, about his travels between Southern American ports during what he calls his coasting years. And in some ways, you could say Cobb doesn't hold back. He admits to all sorts of illegal and unscrupulous acts that make him a favorite among Boston's shipping elite. He smuggles contraband, he cheats the embargo, he bribes his way into and out of European ports, he outruns the British Navy, He even manages, according to him, to get a private meeting with Robespierre at the height of France's reign of terror following the French Revolution. Anything, it would seem, to secure big returns on his employer's investments. In bragging about his exploits, Cobb comes off as a bit of a rogue, but maybe a charming and likable one. Maybe, in fact, not so different from the sort of character featured in so many of our Hollywood blockbusters, who we idolize for their pluck and cunning, their willingness to risk anything for the love of the chase. But we really shouldn't mistake braggadocio for full disclosure, because Cobb's memoir is just as notable for what it does not tell us. There's a significant portion of the sea captain's career that we never learn about, in fact, because his narrative breaks off before he can describe his final 8 years sailing the world between 1812 and 1820. In a note that must have accompanied the first printed edition of Cobb's memoir in 1857, his grandson explains that the sea captain's health prevented him from recounting the rest of his overseas adventures. And it's certainly possible that ill health was the main obstacle. After all, the man was 75 when he set down the bulk of his memories. But this explanation creates the impression that Cobb grew physically incapable of finishing his memoir. And that is simply not the case. I found these letters in the collection at the Brewster Ladies Library, written by Cobb to his granddaughters, and they date to 1845. That is 2 years after he had stopped writing his memoir. So, what really caused Cobb to end the story of his seafaring career 8 years early? Well, let's consider what he left out. The disastrous 10 Brothers voyage, the story of how he sailed into Boston's harbor in July of 1819 to complete a triangular trajectory that had all the characteristics of a slaving voyage. You have to admit that it's curious looking at this box. This is you can see his initials there on the inside cover. This was acquired just a few months ago by the Brewster Historical Society. It is quite literally a black box, and it is, as you can see, empty. And this is the very sort of document chest that would have accompanied Cobb on his voyages on board these various vessels that he commanded. And yet, I find it odd that a man so prominent, who was so aware of his legacy, that he would have left no records, that, you know, his box, in other words, the archive, all of the primary source documents related to this man, Elijah Cobb, they're gone. They're simply gone with no explanation. Letters included in the 1925 edition of Cobb's memoir by Ralph Payne, that is the man who edited the memoir. These letters testify at least to the fact that 2 voyages occurred, 2 African voyages, one in 1818 and one in 1819. But when Deborah Hill Allen, who married into the Cobb family, when she put together her 2011 edition, it is a very streamlined version of the memoir, she opted not to include those letters Cobb had sent from Africa. And she also left out the introduction in which Ralph Payne mentions that Elijah Cobb goes to Africa. And so all we have is Cobb's own words in which he makes no mention of Africa at all. I believe that the only reason we know Cobb made these African voyages at all is actually because he caused a public health crisis in Boston. Here is the ship, the 10 Brothers. It was beautiful by all accounts. It was fast. It was built to sail the deep waters. In fact, it was built in 1810 in Sullivan, Maine, just an hour and a half east of Liberty. The crew, this is what we know about the crew. You will note that Elijah Cobb was not the captain of the voyage at its outset. That honor went to Joseph Mayo, Jr. Cobb was acting as supercargo, meaning he was responsible for all trade. This voyage is a very good example of the intimate relationship between Brewster and Boston. Brewster men sailed for Boston merchants. You will also note that these last names, they are they're the family names of the greatest seafaring families from my town. There was a second ship sailing in consort with the 10 brothers, and this one was called the schooner Hope. The master, the shipmaster, was David Nickerson. He was a contemporary of Cobb's. Isaac Clark was serving as supercargo on this ship. Now, Isaac Clark was Elijah Cobb's best friend. He had retired from the sea at this point, but his great-granddaughter wrote in her memoir that Clark was tempted out of retirement because the inducements Cobb made to him of what they could earn on this voyage were so exciting that he couldn't resist. We know nothing else about the crew of the Hope. In fact, this vessel is shrouded in mystery for reasons that I will explain later. One important connection between these two vessels, aside from the fact that they're both captained by Brewster men, is that these two captains both sailed together and at different times commanded a different vessel, the Monsoon. The Monsoon, it turns out, pops up in slavevoyages.org, which is the slave voyages database. It is the most comprehensive source that we have containing information about slaving voyages. So as you can see, the Monsoon, it hails from Massachusetts, and it was stopped it was stopped by the British, and it's a known slaving vessel. What is known about it is that it departed Africa with 267 captive Africans on board and arrived at its destination with only 201 captives, which means that 66 enslaved people died during what we call the Middle Passage. That was a typical loss of life percentage. So these two vessels, the 10 Brothers and the Hope, they depart Boston on September 1st, 1818. To be clear, before moving on, we do not know whether Brewster men were on board the Monsoon at the time it was stopped for slave trading. So we cannot say for certain that when Elijah Cobb and David Nickerson commanded the vessel, we don't know exactly what it was doing. But these two vessels, the 10 Brothers and the Hope, leave Boston in September of 1818, and they head for the west coast of Africa. One thing to note here at the outset is that these vessels are going to trace a triangular itinerary, very typical of a slaving voyage. But you would say this can't be a slaving voyage, as slave trading had been outlawed by the US federal government following Britain's lead in 1808. And here we are in 1818, a full decade later. Well, in reality, the practice continued long after that federal ban, right up through the Civil War, in fact, as if you've been following the scholarship of Kate McMahon, from the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, who is from Maine. You will be aware of this. And if you're not yet following Kate, come check out atlanticblackbox.com so that you can learn about her upcoming talks. So the cargo that they had on board was typical also of a slaving voyage. They had tobacco, rum, cloth, and what they call hardware, which could very well mean guns. A previous voyage of the 10 brothers in 1818 had been highly lucrative. Cobb claimed that the commodities he was after on that earlier voyage were gold dust and ivory. They make their first port in Lomboko in the Galinas region of Sierra Leone. This is prime slaving country. Slave trading is the main industry here. And the illegal slave trade thrived here. There was a situation in which American ships could not be boarded by British vessels, couldn't be boarded and searched by the British vessels that were trying to suppress the trade following the ban. And so American vessels were highly prized among slave traders. Lomboko, you may recall, is where the slaves from the Amistad had been taken. This area was known as the white man's grave, mainly to the prevalence of yellow fever. Many mariners considered that the risk was worth it, however, because the trade was just that lucrative. But Lomboko was not just a graveyard for white mariners, of course. The slave fort at Lomboko was known as a capital of cruelty, a place of mass death. Captives would fall out of those longboats you saw in the last image to the sharks that circled in permanence. And those sharks often followed slaving vessels straight across the Atlantic back toward the American coast. So whether or not Cobb and his crew were trading in slaves, doing any business here, they would have not only witnessed these horrors, but they would have been complicit with them. Leaving Sierra Leone, the two vessels made their way down the coast. What was the nature of their trade? Well, at the outset, Cobb said he was after ivory and gold. Is it possible, we should ask ourselves at this point, that they were doing legitimate trade in Africa? Legitimate meaning articles that were not human, right? Human captives. There is one scholar, Brooks, who suggests that a certain amount of legitimate trade was happening even during this early period. However, he situates that trade as occurring up in the Senegal region. And the suggestion by, the consensus among most scholars is that at this point in history, trade along this coastline, which was of course known as the slave coast, that enslaved people would have been the principal motive of trade. Here is Ghana's Elmina slave castle then and now. If any of you are watching the series Enslaved on the channel Epics, Samuel L. Jackson and a group of divers from Diving with a Purpose have been documenting slaving voyages. One of them that left from here, from Elmina. This is yet another slave castle that saw unspeakable horrors. And then the two ships left the coast of Africa for Principe. Now, Principe and Sao Tome, these are former Portuguese colonies. They were a true tropical paradise. In fact, they still are. They made the list of New York Times 52 places to visit in the world. Cobb would have seen this site on entering the harbor. They refer to it as Prince's Island. So what you see here are the vestiges of those Portuguese plantations. They were largely sugar and coffee plantations, entirely run on slave labor. And the why was this a slaving port? Well, its particular attraction was the fact that it was off coast and that it was precisely less, there was less disease here, less yellow fever. So it was less deadly to the European and American mariners who were coming through. So here you see in the front the return from the Columbian Sentinel, the Boston newspaper, when the 10 brothers arrived back in Boston at the close of this voyage. Cobb has stated that his cargo is ivory and coffee. So what is he doing here at Principe? This is not a place to buy ivory. He claims he's here to buy coffee. That is something he tells his wife in a letter. And that's certainly possible. But I want to take a moment to consider exactly, I want to take just a minute to consider the nature of their trade. So to his wife, he says, we're after coffee. He says, honey, I'm going to be a few months late getting home because, you know, got to wait for the coffee harvest. But when the ship returns to Boston, it has some coffee on board, but it is not by any means a commercial amount. So it is not a commercial cargo of coffee. So let's consider, could Cobb have coffee on board that he planned to sell at his next stop, which was Martinique in the Caribbean? Well, that hardly makes sense because Martinique grows its own coffee. And you have a very small planter class that could afford to buy such a thing. And why would they? They have their own coffee. So when Cobb says that he's got to wait here until the crop comes in, I suppose we're to assume that it's for a very small amount of coffee. He tells his wife, I've already put money out, $3,000 to $4,000, and so I can't simply leave. Well, as they're in the harbor at Principe, now I'm going backwards. His crew begin to drop like flies. They are being mauled by mosquitoes, but they don't make the connection between the bites and this illness that is taking them down. Cobb is very much in distress, and so this comes to us by way of these letters that were appended in the first version of his memoir. On February 7th, the boy, Kimball, dies. 4 days later, Elijah Cobb's best friend, Isaac Clarke, the one he had coaxed out of retirement, dies in his arms. 7 days later, Joseph Mayo Jr., the actual captain of the 10 brothers, dies. And Cobb takes command of the two vessels. He was the initiator of this voyage in the first place, and he is the senior senior officer. So he takes it upon himself to reorganize things. The captain of the second ship, the Hope, is very, very sick. So with fever ravaging the crews of both vessels, Cobb decides that they're going to make their way off, away from these islands and get out to sea. So one thing to note, they know yellow fever when they see it. As experienced mariners, most of them with significant experience in the West Indies and along the coast of the American South, yellow fever would have been unmistakable to them. It got very distinct set of symptoms, which I described at the outset. What they didn't know was that it was that particular type of Aedes aegypti mosquitoes that were carrying the virus from one person to the next. When Boston's Board of Health later investigates this voyage, they conclude that Cobb's actions in the face of this horror that he was experiencing were not only responsible, they call them heroic. So I'd like to consider with you briefly what choices Elijah Cobb actually made. So on February 20th, after at least 4 of his men, and not just any, right? These were his fellow townspeople. These were close friends. They were even relatives of his. 4 men died before his eyes. Cobb takes command. He appoints someone to conduct his business on the island. And he appoints a man named Dillingham captain of the Hope, because Captain Nickerson is languishing. They leave Principe to get out of the sickly harbor. And as they're leaving, another boy dies offshore. Cobb himself gets sick, but he recovers. Possibly he developed immunity earlier in his life. They spend a month out further at sea, and then the ships return to the sickly harbor at Principe to conclude their commerce in full knowledge of the risk. So not only do they go back to the port where these 4 men have died, but they spend another 2 months between Principe and Sao Tome before sailing for Martinique. And again, what for? So Cobb, again, he told his wife it was the coffee, but there wasn't enough coffee when he arrived back in Boston to explain all the time that he spent here, and especially considering the amount of death and the great risk he took. So one other thing to know is that he made a completely different claim to the inspectors of Boston's Board of Health on arriving back in Boston. They saw that he had very little coffee and knew that it wasn't coffee that he sold in Martinique. So they asked him quite simply, what cargo did you carry from Principe to Martinique? And Cobb said, 1,800 bushels of Indian corn. 1,800 bushels of Indian corn. Now, the inspectors, when they asked him this question, were pointing on his vessel to a few putrid ears of corn that they found stuffed up in the timbers and in the ceilings of the vessel. So Cobb says it was corn that he purchased at Principe and sold in Martinique. Let's consider that. Indian corn is, of course, a crop native to New England. And I told you earlier that New England, being, from the time we were just the northern British colonies and the islands of the West Indies were the southern British colonies in the Americas, there was a very well-worn trade route so that New Englanders, folks from up this way, were sailing their crops, their grains, their livestock and such down to these Caribbean islands regularly. I mean, that made up the principal part of our seafaring activities through the centuries. So why wouldn't Cobb, if his intention had been to sell Indian corn in the Caribbean, why wouldn't he just make a coastal trip? I mean, it was far less dangerous, far less expensive, far less time consuming. That would have been the economic and really intelligent option for a smart sea captain and merchant trader such as Captain Cobb. That's not what he did. He he went to Africa supposedly for corn. One thing to know about Indian corn that might help to explain the presence of corn on board is that it was a grain that was commonly crushed and made into a gruel and fed to the enslaved captives along their journey over the Middle Passage. So corn was frequently used to feed the enslaved. Perhaps that's why it was on board. So I'm just going to fast forward and tell you very quickly that they arrive in Martinique. They make quick work of unlading their cargo, and they are on their way. Martinique, of course, end-to-end sugar plantations run entirely on slave labor. After the passage of the 10 brothers in Martinique, a yellow fever outbreak occurred. And so later the Board of Health was curious to know whether Cobb believed his ship to have been diseased at that point or not. They head back to Boston, just 19 days en route. And along the way, Cobb's nephew and namesake dies of what Cobb reports to have been a cold. He got a cold. I told you, of course, that the ship arrived smelling to high heaven, which is a signifier of slave trading. This was very, very well known. People at the time would have recognized this unmistakable stench. It was the smell of death, quite simply, of hundreds of bodies, you know, in their urine, the disease, many, you know, died in the hold itself, the vomit, but what have you, just extremely excruciating conditions. So the 10 brothers arrives at Quarantine Island, Rainsford Island, and it is supposed to, according to quarantine regulations, spend quite a long time there. And that is because it all came after the terrible yellow fever epidemic caused by the hanky back in 1793, when Philadelphia was the capital of the nation. It caused 5,000 deaths, 20,000 people to flee the city. And from that point on, that was when our boards of health were born. And our quarantine regulations largely come out of that terrible tragedy. These quarantine regulations, I'll go through them quickly, but one by one, Cobb actually evaded them. He made very quick work at Rainsford and got on his way to Long Wharf. So he broke many rules, but one that is particularly egregious: no visitors, right? If you're in quarantine, you're not supposed to have anyone visiting. Well, the very day that Cobb was planning to sail into Boston Harbor to Long Wharf. His wife and young son and his older son and nephew joined him on board the 10 Brothers. Highly irregular. And one might suspect that he did this sort of as a photo op, like, look, I wouldn't have my family on board if there were anything wrong with this ship. And very quickly, after they arrive at Long Wharf in Boston, the outbreak begins. So you can imagine a customs officer, Eaton, he comes on board the 10 Brothers, he goes into the hold, he gets bitten by a mosquito. That mosquito is carrying the yellow fever virus. Then Eaton goes to any number of other vessels that are currently at port in Boston and gets bit by a second mosquito. Now that mosquito is taking the virus from his blood and is going to go bite another person. That is how the yellow fever spreads very quickly throughout the wharf area in Boston. You can see these numbers are very small. And that's because the officials did everything in their power to downplay the severity of this outbreak. Does that sound familiar? There were stories that hundreds, thousands of people were dying, and these were not being recorded in the newspapers. In fact, all of the physicians of Boston, so many of them, were reporting that this was an outbreak of yellow fever, but the authorities in Boston, they absolutely did not want there to be a yellow fever scare, because what would that mean? It would mean they would have to shut down the port, shut down commerce, right? We know this now today, right? We're living this very thing. So what the Board of Health did was they contradicted all of the most prominent physicians of the city and discredited those who were claiming that this was yellow fever. They said nonsense. I was able to get access to the internal records of the Boston Board of Health for this period. And as this outbreak is occurring, there's this very curious instance. I was able to make out the first sentence of this fully redacted, I mean, so carefully redacted document. And it reads, the subscriber having heard a communication from Dr. Welsh. Now, the important thing to know is that Dr. Welsh was the port physician. He is the one who would have had direct contact with the 10 Brothers vessel. I'm hoping someday that a forensic analyst will be able to help me make out the rest of this letter. But the Board of Health, because there was this tremendous outcry among the population in Boston, was forced to respond. The Board of Health was not made up of physicians. These were appointed officials who were, they were political appointees, in other words, and they had no experience with medicine. But it was really, their job was to keep the population safe, and yet they were very much under the sway of political interests. And who were those who had the upper hand in those days? The shipping interest, of course. And so the Board of Health writes this report. They issue a number of orders, which are very, very interesting. The first, they say that in their report, they say that they ordered this ship scuttled and sunk. They ordered the ship scuttled and sunk, and the order was immediately carried into effect, they insist, because everyone, like I said, knows that this is the source of the yellow fever outbreak. Well, it must have been quite embarrassing when they had to make this order a second time after having said that it had been complied with. Now they say on the 17th of August, there's a new order directed the removal of said ship to the opposite side of the channel and again to be scuttled and sunk. This order too was complied with, they say. That's curious. And then a third time, believe it or not, within the space of 11 days, on the 23rd of August, they passed another order directing that the ship be removed to quarantine ground near Hospital Island and there again scuttled and sunk. All of these orders were faithfully carried into effect. So what are we to understand? That the ship was actually within the space of 11 days sunk 3 times and then refloated? This raised all kinds of red flags when I read the report. In fact, it was the owners of the ship that were supposed to have sunk it, and they simply didn't. And the Board of Health had no power over these wealthy merchant traders. They were much more powerful, and they simply flouted the authority of the board. Well, wouldn't you know, right at the moment when this outbreak is occurring, something more exciting, a distraction technique perhaps, is happening. The newspaper starts publishing news of a sea serpent in Boston Harbor. And it's very curious how the sea serpent story gets bigger and bigger, and finally makes its way to the front page, which, by the way, the yellow fever outbreak never does in the Columbian Sentinel. Elijah Cobb was accused of 2 very serious crimes. The first, contraband slave trading, and the second, knowingly bringing the plague to Boston. Now, I haven't found the original accusation. I hope to still. What I did find was Elijah Cobb's rebuttal of this accusation, which he published. He felt so compelled to publish because his reputation had been so maligned. So here he is defending his honor and denying everything. No, I was not slave trading. No, I didn't know that the ship was diseased when I sailed it into the harbor. And no, I didn't cheat the quarantine regulations. And the Board of Health exonerated him. They said that, nope, it does not appear that, it seems that Cobb has been telling the truth, and the ship was not engaged in the slave trade, they say. In fact, everyone was beautiful. Everyone patted themselves on the back. There was a slight conflict of interest as the Board of Health patted its own self on the back. But everyone up until now, anyone who has known about this case, and there are fairly few who have taken an interest in this, believed that this ship was actually destroyed after, the Board of Health ordered it be so. And it turns out that it wasn't. And I discovered this thanks to Google. And this is not to pat my own self on the back. This is to say that we're in a much better position today to do this sort of research, despite the challenges that it presents, because so many documents have been digitized. So in Googling, I found a ship's log that is held at the Peabody Essex Museum Library, the Phillips Library. And it was for a 10 brothers, a ship 10 brothers, but the date was 1820. And I thought, that can't possibly be my 10 brothers because it was sunk in 1819. Well, it turns out it is the very same ship, and one can see that clearly in the registration. It's the exact same tonnage. It's the chain of ownership is direct, and in fact, Humphrey, who was one of the owners during this fiasco, remains owner after the 10 brothers returned from Africa. The 10 brothers sailed from Boston to Salvador, Brazil, following this incident. And this happens to be the #1 destination of African captives. So you may know that under 500,000 captive Africans were brought to North America during the course of the slave trade. Contrast that with Cuba, the small island of Cuba, which received over 500,000 enslaved Africans. And then Brazil, over 5 million Africans were brought to Brazil. The other claim that was made in the past is that the contagion was contained, that the ship was sunk, and so that was it. The yellow fever didn't do any more damage, and that's not true either. New York suffered a very severe outbreak. It shut down all of Lower Manhattan, and as you can see, the number 66 people died. That is seriously, seriously underreported. But New York pointed directly to Boston, and they said, you are responsible for our outbreak. You should have shut down your port. And they pointed directly at the 10 brothers. They said, we know where this comes from. Charleston was hit very hard. Already by September 15th, they reported 105 deaths. But of course, it was much greater than that. And in a city like Charleston, the yellow fever season wouldn't end until the frosts came much later than in the north to kill off the mosquitoes. Baltimore was devastated. 2,287 reported deaths. And again, tip of the iceberg, because we know how intent these authorities were all everywhere to underreport the actual deaths. They had to set up a tent city to house all the displaced persons. And actually, it took on pandemic proportions because it spread throughout the Atlantic world that year. What did the Board of Health do? The Boston Board of Health shrugged and said, diseases are heaven's messengers. We really couldn't have done anything to prevent this, which is sort of the height of cynicism, because that's exactly what they are meant to do by enforcing regulations. Elijah Cobb went back to Brewster. He settled at home after this incident and just laid low, hoping that it would blow over. He was not maligned by the other people in the town. You would think that after 7 Brewster men died on this voyage, that if the townsfolk disapproved of Elijah Cobb's decision making, you would think that he would have gotten a lot of heat from them for having placed the lives of his men in danger by hanging out at Principe, even after the first 4 deaths and such. But no, in fact, Elijah Cobb was showered with honors after he returned from this voyage. You might call it a sort of whitewashing. So Elijah Cobb lived to the old age of 80, and he was buried, and on his headstone, it reads, "The end of the upright man is peace." That's how we've chosen to remember Cobb. And never once has it occurred to us to ask if others, if others actually play out the scenario and imagine that this could have been a slaving voyage. How many others might have died? How many others might never have had a headstone? I like to tell the story of the diseased ship, not because it gives me pleasure, but because I find it so very representative of of New England's merchant trade in the 19th century, and the way that New England has chosen to honor its sea captains and its seafaring men. We have not asked the right questions. We have not dug deep to find out what the nature of their commerce actually was. And we have not stretched our imagination to even consider the very, very, very likely possibility, as in this case, that this was a slaving voyage. So I would just ask you to consider that a ship the size of the 10 Brothers, and this comes straight from Marcus Rediker, who is the premier scholar of the slave trade. I asked him what a ship like that, like had this been a slaving voyage, how many Africans may have been on board? And he told me between 300 and 400 easily. So I would just ask you to take just a moment to think about that. And then I'm very happy to take your questions.
Well, thank you, Meadow. That was really, really fascinating. There is a couple questions in chat, and I'll ask those. And then if people want to unmute themselves and ask questions, you're welcome to. The first question is, who redacted the Boston of Health report after it was written?
So, so what I showed you, that carefully redacted report, that was in the internal documents. And I have no idea who redacted it. I do know that Benjamin Whitman was the head of the Board of Health at the time. And he, in another incident where someone came to report to him, a physician, Dr. Gorham, came to report to Benjamin Whitman that a yellow fever outbreak was taking place on Fort Hill. Whitman did not want to substantiate that report. So is it possible that he was the one who crossed out every line? Clearly somebody on the inside didn't want what Dr. Welsh knew to make its way to us or to the public at the time. There's another report that I made reference to, which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And it's thanks to that report that was published, the one I showed you a number of citations from, that we know something about the voyage. Of course, it's, how reliable is that narrator? There are just so many red flags in that report that it smacks of, it's just spin, right? So it's very problematic. It's hard to want, in the case of that published report, it gives us some details about the voyage, which are very welcome in trying to reconstruct what happened. But always, you have to have in front of mind that this could be, that the details could have been incorrectly reported in the depositions themselves that were taken, and they could be incorrectly represented by the members of the Board of Health, who are so strongly influenced by the shipping interest.
Another question from Martha. have you ever found any other Cape Cod history scholars who address slave ships from the region?
I have not. No. In fact, when this case, when I began to uncover this story, I was so shocked that the history of our maritime trade had not been written. That the last book to attempt like an actual overview of Cape Cod's maritime trade was published in 1935 by Kittredge, who was a descendant of sea captains. And this is what you commonly find. Maybe this is true here in Maine as well, where it's often the descendants who write fairly glowing biographies of their ancestors. And that's how we come by our knowledge, and so hardly unbiased, right? I think it's astounding. I didn't know what to make of it, that historians had not taken interest in Cape Cod's maritime trade. I mean, that's all we had, right? After we clear cut the peninsula and sent all of that lumber down to the West Indies. I mean, farming was never possible on that sandy spit of land. All we made, all of our commerce was taking place offshore, overseas. So the fact that there's this big gaping hole that no one has really dug into this, I find astounding. I find it especially astounding. I told you I'm a literary scholar. I'm used to walking into Brown University Library, for instance, and finding entire shelves devoted to one particular novel, for example. It strikes me that there is a glut of interest in certain academic topics and this absolute dearth in other areas, which I think can only be explained by white supremacy, a very real reluctance to take apart, deconstruct these narratives, these celebratory narratives of New England, because we are so entrenched in this myth of the free North, of New England having stood resolutely on the right side of history. And now we know this is absolutely not the case. So you asked about scholars working on Cape Cod history. No, there are not. But I mentioned during my talk Kate McMahon, who is focused her research on Maine's role in the slave trade, and specifically the illicit slave trade. So do look her up. Lise Breen, I see, is here on the call right now. She is an independent researcher working on Cape Ann slavery and slave traders. So essentially, when I discovered this real dearth in scholarship in this area on New England's entanglements in the slave trade, that's when I had the idea to create Atlantic Black Box, which is an organization devoted to researching and reckoning with New England's role in the slave trade and the business of slavery more generally. And it really exists as a platform, a hub, and a clearinghouse for all those doing research in this area. So whether they are scholars, there aren't that many of them, but they do exist, or they are independent researchers, folks such as myself who happen to accidentally, come upon this history and feel that these are questions that need answering. And Atlantic Black Box basically is founded on the premise that everyone can and should participate in uncovering this history, because there is so much of it to uncover here in New England. And it is that we cannot leave this to the historians. Clearly, the fact that this stuff has gone unstudied or understudied for 200 years and more, we need to, this is a matter of civic responsibility. We need to, in our communities, do history at the micro local level, all of us. And so Atlantic Black Box exists to encourage essentially community researchers. Everyone, wherever you are, pick up a shovel, start digging, and Atlantic Black Box will help to empower you, give you the tools to do good research, and then contribute your findings to what we call the Black Box, a place where everyone can go for that reliable data, so that we begin to know what happened here and to connect the dots.
Elizabeth Dodge has a question, but I'm afraid I don't quite understand it. So Elizabeth, if you could unmute yourself and ask the question, I would appreciate it.
Just clicked.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just curious. There's so much literature that is disjointed about kind of the lifeways and trafficking medicinal herbs and sugar and rum for different periods of the economies of scale in New England. I'm wondering if those maps have been done more intricately, because some of what I've seen really overlapped with some of the maps that you showed.
Yeah, interesting. I don't really know how to take that one on. But let's, yeah, I mean, let me think about it in some more depth, and feel free to email me too with questions. It's you can get me at meadow@diseasedship.com, or you can get to me through atlanticblackbox.com as well.
Thank you.
Question from Hogwarts. Does Meadow imagine that the enslaved people were dropped off at Martinique?
That's right. That's right. If indeed there were enslaved people on this vessel, they would have been, or the majority of them would have been dropped off in Martinique. I completely, to my surprise, this was really the last thing I expected, but I have come to suspect that actually a number of captive Africans were actually brought back to Boston on board the vessel in 1820, which is kind of mind-blowing, right? Because Massachusetts, we like to think that we abolished slavery in the late, 1780s, but there are indications that, well, it's clear from my research that actually Elijah Cobb smuggled some illicit cargo off of the 10 Brothers the very day it arrived at Rainsford Island. And then the man who helped him smuggle that cargo he was patient zero. He was the first person to die of yellow fever when the outbreak occurred, the first person that we know of. But yes, short answer is yes.
I've been trying to go through the chat, and I know there's a few comments, but if anybody would like to ask a question, this is probably a good time to do it. And I did put the link for the Atlantic Black Box website in the chat if you'd like to do that.
I have a question. I was wondering, with the estimate that you gave on the ship's capacity for slave holding, approximately 300 slaves, you said, that would be an enormous amount of money that he would have made in Martinique. And I was wondering if you followed the money in the Boston area after he got back, and see if he suddenly turned up with this enormous amount of wealth that he would have gained from this voyage.
Yes. So on following the money is absolutely, one of the important sort of techniques in doing this sort of research. You're absolutely right. I haven't yet done a lot of work on the owners of the vessel, but that is one area where I really plan to dig. Elijah Cobb himself, he over the course of his seafaring career, he owned 26 different properties in and around Brewster. And many of them in this later period, right, of his career. So it does appear that he acquired a great deal of wealth in these later years. And his son, Elijah Jr., he had set him up as a merchant trader with an office in Boston. And so it's possible too that a good deal of his revenue was sort of going straight into that business as well. Thanks for the question.
Another question from Martha. If the ship was so stinky, how could they keep using it?
Oh, I know. Well, they did. They would routinely scrub these ships down. They would fumigate them. They would scrub them down with lime and vinegar. And yeah, it is surprising, but they absolutely did. I see a question, did any of Cobb's family die in 1819? Really interestingly, his wife, in one of the letters that Cobb actually wrote, 2 letters that were published in the Boston press following the ship's return to Boston. And in the first one, it was in response, clearly a reporter had written him a letter asking him a number of questions. I wish I had that original letter, but it was, it was in Cobb's, empty box, no doubt, as a form of correspondence. But Cobb's response was to say that his wife had gotten the fever, and that she was suffering, but she's better now. So let's stick with that for just a minute. So I described this scene where, his family is brought on board the vessel at Quarantine Island. They're not supposed to, this is against the regulations, but no sooner do they come on board than they sail into Boston Harbor. In Cobb's second letter that he published in the Columbian Sentinel, the one that I did show you where he denies everything, his linchpin argument, his key argument is, would I have, if I had known that this was a diseased vessel, would I have brought my wife and kids on board? Would I really have exposed them to the virus? And so you would think it's a pretty strong argument, right? He says, I would have to be the most unfeeling brute in all of existence to put my own wife and kids at risk. This might have some modern resonance for anyone who's, but in reality, he is a seasoned sea captain. He knows there's not a tremendous amount of risk if his wife and kids are on the deck, are on the upper deck, right? It's when you go into the hold. Now, he might not have understood that it was because there are mosquitoes in the hold, which is all shut up, and not mosquitoes up on board, right? But that's the reality. It was as soon as they opened the hold and the mosquitoes came out that the yellow fever started to spread. But, you know, Cobb, that whole time, you know, the voyage back, whatever, had kept the hold shut and stayed away. I'm sure certain that he wasn't going down into the hold, right? And he no doubt kept his wife and sons from going anywhere near it, right? I see someone is a bit confused. Let's see. Did he drop off diseased slaves in Martinique, or was he trying to bring a few more slaves to New England who died and were buried at sea? So yes, I know it is confusing. It's a lot of information to take in. But the short answer is, so we don't know for certain that this was a slaving voyage. There is a huge pile, I would say, of circumstantial evidence pointing to the fact that this was very likely a slaving voyage, okay? If there were indeed captive Africans on board, yes, the principal place of disembarkation and sale would have been Martinique. However, as I said, I believe that actually some of those Africans were brought back to Boston and sold on the down low clandestinely, that they were taken off the ship, smuggled off at night by the man who ended up being patient zero.
Are there any final questions before we say goodnight?
Well, super. And I just want to invite, any and all of you to come to atlanticblackbox.com to find out more about what we're doing. There are many people are beginning to blog. So you'll find stories from individuals, descendants, institutions like the Penobscot Marine Museum. They're doing sort of a deep audit of their holdings through the lens of this racial history. And there are many more in the wings about to begin writing as well. So that's a great place to come and share, come ask your questions. Everyone is welcome. Thank you so much for your attention. It's been a real pleasure talking with you.
There's a lot of great comments, fascinating. Thank you very much. Thank you, great presentation. And where will we find the recording when it's ready? I will probably put it on, I definitely will put it on the website and probably on Facebook as well. So Meadow, thank you very much. I really found this fascinating, and
thank you.
For everybody else who joined us, have a good evening.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.